Hello, and welcome to Decarbonize, the clean energy podcast from Fresh Energy. Fresh Energy is a Minnesota nonprofit working to shape and drive bold policy solutions to achieve equitable, carbon neutral economies. Today, I am joined by Fresh Energy's Alan Gleckner, Lead Director of Clean Electricity, and we are going to talk about Xcel Energy's Integrated Resource Plan. On February 11th, Fresh Energy, along with Clean Grid Alliance, Union of Concerned Scientists, and Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, filed expert comments on Xcel Energy's Integrated Resource Plan, also known as an IRP, with the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission. IRPs are critical because they lay out how utilities expect to invest in electricity generation over the next 15 years. So Xcel Energy filed its draft IRP with the Public Utilities Commission in July of 2020, and due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the process was slowed down and delayed. So now, about 9 months later, Fresh Energy is finally filing our comments on the IRP with the Commission. So over the next half hour or so, we are going to discuss the comments Fresh Energy and partners filed in response to Xcel's IRP. While there are some things to celebrate, there's definitely room for improvement, and we're going to dig into some of those details today. We'll be joined a bit later by Fresh Energy's Ben Passer, Lead Director of Energy Access and Equity, who will share how the Energy Efficiency for All Coalition has responded to the IRP. But now, let's turn to Alan and talk specifically about our filing. Alan, welcome and thank you for being here.
Thanks, Joe. Happy to be here.
Well, finally filing Fresh Energy's comments on Xcel's IRP must have been an amazing feeling, considering how long this process has been going on. So, of course, even though our comments on the IRP are filed, you still have, I think, both Minnesota Power and Otter Tail Power's IRPs coming up this year. So, no rest for you. That's a conversation for another day. But before we talk specifics about our feedback on Xcel's IRP, let's take a step back and discuss why integrated resource plans in general are so important. So am I correct in saying that at a really basic level, when you flip a light switch in your house, the kind of power that light is using is decided by an integrated resource plan?
Great question, Joe. And yeah, at the most basic level, yes, that is a correct way to characterize it. The electricity you use in your home or at your business, whether it's coming from coal, nuclear, wind, solar, or something else, is really underpinned by an integrated resource plan or an IRP in Minnesota, if you're a Minnesota electricity user. And in other states, many states use a similar process. So yeah, a large part of our state's electricity future is dependent on these plans and the choices made by our major public utilities like Xcel, Great River Energy, Minnesota Power, Otter Tail Power, a number of which all have IRPs this year. So no lack of things for us to be working on, but also by the, what kind of energy we're using through these plans is also decided by the Public Utilities Commission, the regulator, who is the ultimate decider of whether these utility plans that are in front of them are in the public interest.
Okay, so and to be clear, Minnesotans have the power to influence how these public utilities generate power, as well as their plans for the future through the integrated resource planning public process we're discussing today. How often does this process happen for each utility?
In practice, it's every few years or so. The requirement is every 2 years, but it takes a while for each of these plans to go through the process. So in reality, it's somewhere around every few years, and really depends on the complexity for each of the different utilities. But there's 11 major utilities in this that provide electricity to Minnesota customers. 3 of which are investor-owned utilities: Minnesota Power, Xcel, and Otter Tail, like we discussed. And then the other are generation and transmission cooperatives that provide the electricity for rural electric co-ops and municipal utilities. So there's every few years for 11 utilities. It keeps all the regulators and stakeholders busy. The IRP ultimately lays out a 15-year roadmap for each utility that includes, at its most basic level, a 15-year forecast for how much electricity a particular utility's customers will need, and then how the utility plans to provide for that electricity through all the different means of making electricity or reducing it through efficiency or other things like that. And the official planning period is 15 years. A lot of the modeling will look at 30 up to 30 or 40 year period. But really what the most important thing, and generally the focus, is on what's called the 5-year action plan. So that's talking about, here's our business plan, here's our plan for providing our electricity, but here's what we're really going to do in the next 5 years. And in electricity sector, 5 years is a very, very near term, because a lot of this stuff takes a lot of time to implement and build and put into place. So while there's a 15-year period and we're looking out, it's sort of like the closer to now that something is proposed or part of the plan, the more actionable it is and the more set in stone it would be from that plan, versus if it's 15 years out, we're going to have a couple more plans before that takes place and things can change and evolve. So we really focus on the near term parts of it, and then the long term vision too. Are we heading to where we need to be going?
Got it. That's really, really helpful. So you could say, in a nutshell, if Fresh Energy, the public, and other advocates want to shape a future in Minnesota that's carbon neutral by 2040, an integrated resource plan is one of the major levers that we can pull to influence things like closing gas plants and not building new fossil gas plants and closing coal plants and so on. So if you're ready, I want to discuss in more detail Xcel Energy's IRP, which, as we said before, you've been living and breathing for a long time now, with our partners, Clean Grid Alliance, Union of Concerned Scientists, and Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy. So let's start with the positive. Xcel has a vision for 100% carbon-free electricity by 2050 and a plan to achieve 80% carbon-free electricity generation by 2030. Tell me a little bit more about this.
Yeah, so Xcel took a really bold leadership step a couple years ago when they announced a vision and what, a commitment to reaching 100% carbon-free electricity by 2050. And they were one of the first, if not the first, major utilities in the country to do that. Tons have followed suit, and it really signals, the direction that they're going, and acknowledging the transition that we're making in the electric sector, and that's going to underpin carbon reduction in a bunch of other sectors too. So, that's generally reflected in the plan. There's some things that you might say are not consistent with that, and we'll get into that later. But generally, that's the direction they're going, and it's right where we need to be going. We can talk, we might have some quibbles with the timing there, but, big picture, it's where we need to be going. And then in a more near term, and like I said, 2030, not that far away in terms of electricity planning, they've committed to an 80% carbon reduction from 2005 levels by 2030. And that is reflected in the IRP. The IRP does a number of things on the carbon reduction front, particularly adds a bunch of new wind and solar. Their plan has 9,000 megawatts of new wind, 4,500 megawatts of new solar, the equivalent of 2,000 megawatts of energy efficiency. So it is very indicative of the shift we're having, with some caveats that we'll be talking about more.
Sure, thanks. Xcel is also moving forward with coal retirements and operations changes to coal plants. Can you talk a little bit about what that is and what it means for carbon emissions and electricity generation here?
Yeah, so I mean, the biggest driver of the carbon reduction in Xcel's plan, and the biggest thing they're doing to make their carbon reduction commitments, is they've announced in this plan the retirement of all their remaining coal plants. So they have 2 coal plant locations with a few different units at some of them. So in Sherburne County in Becker, Minnesota, the Sherco coal plant, they've already announced retirement dates for Sherco units 1 and 2. And then in this plan, announced the retirement date for Sherco 3, the third and newest unit there, and that would be in 2030. And then their other coal plant outside of Stillwater, Minnesota, on the Minnesota River, is the Allen S. King plant, and they've announced a retirement date for that in 2028. So we're really pleased with those coal retirements. We're pleased that Xcel is exiting the coal business, acknowledging that coal is not going to be part of their electricity mix, and that's been a huge effort of Fresh Energy and focus for us, and then a huge carbon reduction as well, since those are by far the biggest carbon emitters on Xcel's electric system, biggest sources of carbon emissions in the state in a lot of ways from those coal plants. So, not to mention public health benefits and all that. So that's huge. That's a great part of their plan. Another thing that's been part of this plan and part of some other processes that we've been involved in at the Public Utilities Commission and with Xcel is that not only are they announcing those retirement dates, but in the meantime, we still have 9 years before 2030 for Sherco 3 and a little bit less for some of the other plants. They're changing the way they're operating those coal units in a way that they'll run much, much less, including some of them and maybe all of them eventually will be completely turned off for large portions of the year. And so that is also a major carbon reduction strategy, and it's critically important because we're getting those emissions reductions immediately when they change those operations. It can happen as soon as that goes into effect, and it's really meaningful. And we have some blog posts on that on our website that folks can check out, where we kind of quantify the amount of carbon savings from those operational changes.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you, Alan. Well, and of course, with the closure of any facility comes concern for the community and worker resilience in that community. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, it's a really important thing for us to mention here is that as we're transitioning the electric sector, there's also impacts to obviously the workers at the old infrastructure, the plants that have been providing electricity to our state, powering our economy for decades now, and that those folks, it's really important that they're taken care of, and as well that the communities that have hosted these plants, there's really major impacts to them as well when we transition away from and make this necessary transition, and that those can't be overlooked. And so Xcel has committed to making sure that no utility worker, plant worker is losing their job in this transition, that they're going to be able to either be transitioned in the company or other workforce transition type of stuff. So we think that's really important and great. Also, Xcel's done a really good job of communicating and coordinating with their communities, particularly Becker, Minnesota, where those 3 big coal units are. They've already worked with, done a lot of work. They brought in a massive Google data center to that community, which is a huge economic development opportunity. They've worked to bring other businesses there and worked on other economic development issues there. And so Xcel's really taken this on, and I think is committed to doing more. We're committed to trying to work through the state and other places to help this issue and help this transition for communities and workers. It's certainly not solved and taken care of. It's an ongoing thing, but it's a really important thing too. And our hope is, bigger picture, that we know that there's a ton of jobs and economic development through this transition in new sources of energy, obviously wind and solar, and we really want to see those jobs going to local workers, being family supporting jobs. Ideally there's a big role for union labor in that. So we want to acknowledge that we're really concerned about all those things, want to work on all those things. We're doing our best to work on all those, but it's an ongoing and very important issue.
Thank you, Alan. There are also some details in the IRP about energy efficiency, and we're going to wait to discuss those in a little bit when we're joined by Ben Passer. So I guess that brings us to the part of the conversation where we get to chat about what in the IRP needs improvement. So let's start with the most high profile and hot button issue, the new methane-based fossil fuel plant in Becker, Minnesota. What can you tell us about Xcel's proposal there?
Yeah, so this is the main glaring problem we have with this IRP, and in it, so Xcel is saying in this IRP that they're going to continue to pursue a new 835 megawatt fossil gas plant in Becker, Minnesota, where Xcel's Sherco coal units currently are. They are projecting the plant to cost between $1.5 and $2 billion. And this plant was one that was pushed through the legislature in 2017 without any meaningful analysis to support it, or any review of carbon-free alternatives, or really any other alternatives. And that legislation created a pathway for the plant, but certainly didn't say that it must be built. And so despite all of the advancements since 2017 in the sector and technology advancements, et cetera, Xcel insists in this IRP that they're going to continue pursuing building that plant, despite still not providing any analysis that it's a good investment or looking at carbon-free alternatives. On top of that, this proposed fossil gas plant will emit millions of tons of new greenhouse gases, thereby contributing to global warming and further undermining Minnesota's ability to reach our emission reduction goals.
So what you're saying that is despite Xcel's carbon reduction goals, they would be spending upwards of $2 billion on a very large new fossil power plant in 6 years, even though it's already becoming an antiquated, inefficient, and expensive form of electricity production. I know you've worked with expert consultants and done extensive research and modeling to develop our recommendations for the PUC. Can you talk about this analysis and the results?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we're in addition to kind of big picture why this plan is obviously just a bad idea, we undertook some pretty detailed analysis to really put data and numbers behind that. And so we focused on two main analyses. One is more economic focused. It uses the same planning software that Xcel and our other state utilities use to look at what types of electricity generation are most economic or optimal when you put in a bunch of assumptions. How much electricity do we need? What are the different costs of different ways to make electricity? All those things, you put it into a model and it'll optimize and tell you which ones are the most economic choice to meet the electricity needs that we're going to have. And there's different assumptions that can go in there, and so you can compare the costs of different types of electricity generation over a long period of time. And this one would go, the modeling goes through 2045, like we talked about. It's a 15-year planning period, but the near term is the most kind of important part of that. So we did that analysis, which is kind of the same one, or is the same type of analysis that the utility does when it puts its plan together. And then we did a second one focused more on reliability, like big grid, regional electric grid level reliability analysis, which is essentially looking at, okay, Xcel's making this big transition. They're taking these major big coal generators and retiring them. Are there going to be any big grid reliability implications from that? And so we retained an expert that has a ton of experience doing that, using the exact same software that our grid operator would use to do the same type of analysis of, okay, when we retire coal plants or any other big generators, what kind of reliability impact should we expect? And we did that reliability analysis looking specifically at, okay, when Xcel retires all their coal plants, would this new proposed gas plant, this giant Sherco gas plant, is that needed to solve reliability issues that come up when we retire all this coal? And we found that it did not. It was not needed to solve any reliability issues when you retire all of Xcel's coal. So that is a key piece. Obviously, we're not advocating for an electric system that's not reliable or can't keep the lights on. So that was a major thing to look at. And then back to our economic kind of optimal energy supply modeling, we first just looked at, is this proposed gas plant economic? And even using Xcel's assumptions, when you just allow the model to say, here's an option, you can pick it or you don't have to, it doesn't pick it. It's not optimal. Xcel and all their modeling forced it into the model, said the model had to take it, and did all kind of use that as their baseline. We just simply allowed the model to say, do you want this or not? And it did not. Too expensive, not optimal for our resource. And then we did some other steps where we kind of updated assumptions, used more current market-based cost assumptions for wind, solar, battery storage, that type of thing, and came up with what in essence is an alternative resource plan to the one Xcel is putting forward. That our plan doesn't add any new fossil plants, including the big proposed one we've been talking about. Also doesn't add any other ones through the planning period. Adds more solar, a lot of battery storage, 4-hour battery storage. And when we look at more reasonable assumptions, is cheaper on every kind of sensitivity that we looked at than Xcel's preferred plan, and cheaper than even a nearly identical plan, but that has the big gas plant. So we kind of isolated the economics of the big gas plant and found that our plan with more renewables, batteries, no new fossil was cheaper. And specifically, the model kind of tells us that rather than building that big new fossil gas plant, we can substitute essentially 1,000 megawatts or 1,000 megawatt solar, 250 megawatt battery storage hybrid plant as a kind of a direct substitute and be cheaper. So pretty excited about that. Really feel strongly that that's analytically sound and kind of using the exact same tools as the utility, and shows that plant and Xcel's insistence on going forward with it is a really bad idea on a number of levels. Oh, and can't forget that we also modeled the difference in carbon emissions and some other pollutant emissions when you include the gas plant, and it's very, very significant. So obviously our plan that doesn't build any new fossil has significantly less carbon emissions than both Xcel's plan and a plan with that plant.
Yeah, Alan, so I'm wondering if we have any listeners who are maybe super wonky, is there a way that they can log in and see our filed comments and maybe get some more of those technical details that you were just talking about? Or is that
Absolutely. Yeah,
okay?
and we'll have that linked in our blog post on our website for sure. Just you can just
Okay,
click through. Yep.
perfect. So let's move on to one of the other big items in Xcel's IRP. Xcel's proposal to extend the operating life of the Monticello nuclear plant. Can you talk a bit about this issue and Fresh Energy's views on it? How does Fresh Energy's comments on the IRP align with our approach to nuclear?
Yeah. Thanks, Joe. Yeah, I would, from our view, this is the other kind of major issue in the resource plan. So Xcel's plan proposes to extend the operating life of the Monticello nuclear unit in Monticello, Minnesota, which currently is set to be done operating in 2030. They're proposing in their plan to extend it 10-year operating life through 2040. And so, our big Fresh Energy's kind of big picture view on this is that nuclear is currently a carbon-free source of electricity, and that carbon reduction is a huge important part of our electricity system, and that that we prioritize certainly closing coal plants before retiring existing nuclear plants, and also that we would certainly prioritize stopping new fossil fuel infrastructure, and ideally retiring all or almost all of all the rest of the fossil fuel plants that a utility would have before we would be retiring their carbon-free nuclear plants. So that's kind of where we come at this issue from, that existing nuclear plants are different than new nuclear, certainly, and that that they're carbon-free, and that we need to be looking at these other carbon-emitting sources before we would prioritize retiring them before we would prioritize retiring nuclear plants. So that's the big picture where we approach this issue from. How it's reflected in our group comments, our coalition, comments and approach to Xcel's filing is that we kind of in keeping with that approach included the 10-year extension of Monticello in all that analysis I talked about. The economic and reliability analysis include Xcel's proposal to extend the nuclear plant for 10 years at Monticello. We expect that this will continue to be an issue in the plan. A lot of stakeholders, obviously, nuclear has certainly new nukes are very, very expensive. There's well documented that they're enormously expensive to build, and there's been a lot of cost issues in the past, even with existing nuclear plants. Xcel's made a lot of strides reducing the cost of operating their nukes, but certainly the cost issue is the main issue for the extension, and I think that's going to continue to be something that stakeholders look at. We're going to continue to look at what other stakeholders bring to the table on the cost issue, do some of our own analysis, and continue to look at it. But as of this filing, it's in there. The extension is in there, and something that we're moving forward with.
And correct me if I'm wrong here, since Xcel files every 2 years, that's something that could be revisited in future IRP processes, right? Like, is that the right way to think about it?
It really depends on the sequence of how things happen here. The relicensing process takes a long time. There's, investments that go on to make that extension happen. And so whether or not this would, come up again in the next IRP, it's hard to say, kind of just on the sequencing, but no, nothing from this decision, nothing in this IRP would lock that decision in. It's more of a step. Should we proceed with going for a license extension, continue to look into this, continue to plan on doing it, but it wouldn't be set in stone from this plan.
I
Of course,
understand.
the Prairie Island units are their retirement dates 2033 and 2034 will probably be in the planning period and at it in kind of the issue for the next one. So, and
Okay.
that has a lot of other important community aspects with the tribe and the First Nation there. So.
All right, I won't push you anymore on nuclear. So right now we are joined by Ben Passer, Lead Director of Energy Access and Equity at Fresh Energy. Welcome, Ben. Good to hear you and see you. So you have been working with Fresh Energy's Energy Efficiency for All partners, and that group is also known as EFA, I think. So you've been working with them specifically on the energy efficiency aspects of Xcel's IRP. Now, I know we're celebrating that there are energy efficiency savings of over, I think, 780 gigawatt hours in the IRP. Can you translate, what does this mean?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Joe. So what this means is that Xcel is investing in historic levels of energy efficiency. This is important because when we're considering an integrated resource plan, we're talking about how much energy the utility expects to need to serve its customers and how it's going to produce that energy. Energy efficiency is our least cost solution in this equation. It reduces the amount of energy that needs to be generated in the first place, especially important when there are still dirty forms of generation on the grid. It reduces overall demand on the grid, and it saves customers money on their energy bills. And that's especially important for under-resourced customers.
So I know the EFA Coalition has some more critical feedback on the IRP too, especially when it comes to improving equity outcomes through the resource planning process. Now, I know I'm asking you to speak for the whole EFA Coalition here, but can you elaborate on this?
Absolutely. So our EFA coalition, our Energy Efficiency for All coalition, is made up of partner organizations that are interested in and representative of the energy and housing sectors. So it's Fresh Energy and a number of other organizations working at the state, regional, and national levels around these overlapping topics around energy and housing. We've been really glad over the last several years to see Xcel taking positive steps toward equitable outcomes for its customers, increasing its spending on energy efficiency programs serving under-resourced households to proposing expanded assistance programs in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, there's still a lot of work to be done, even in light of these positive steps to advance equity in the energy sector. In our work, I often refer to equity as including both the process and the outcome. And we believe there's room for improvement, quite frankly, in both. First, as I mentioned earlier, Xcel does propose increased energy efficiency and renewable energy through the IRP, but it's important to ensure that those benefits ultimately reach under-resourced customers and communities of color. So while the IRP provides that roadmap of longer-term expectations around energy efficiency as a resource, it will be important for Xcel to really meet the unmet demand and need faced by under-resourced customers through SIP programs, for example. And we know that potential is there from the statewide SIP potential study that was completed a couple of years ago. On the process side, we also think that Xcel can use this IRP to commit to future improvements in the process. This includes supporting the involvement of impacted individuals and communities in program evaluations, exploring the formation of an environmental justice advisory group or accountability board that would have oversight over Xcel's planning, and also committing to tangible goals on diverse recruitment, retention, and advancement at the staff and board levels. All of these improvements in the process will ultimately feed back into and support more equitable outcomes.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you for joining us. I know that you're in the thick of it today. So while I have you both here, is there anything about your area of work on the Xcel IRP that you want to add in that I might have missed in the earlier questions? And Ben, you weren't here for the earlier questions, but is there anything about energy efficiency that you want to make sure to mention?
I would just add, I think this is a really important step in the process. There's opportunity for additional public comment that we have information around on our website. So I think if this is something that's interesting to folks and exciting to folks, definitely encourage anyone else who's interested to get involved and use your voice as well.
Thank you. And Alan, anything you wanna plug before I say farewell to folks?
No, but like we mentioned before, check out the blog on the website and the link to the filing. A bunch more information, probably more than you'd ever want in there. But if you're into it, might be an interesting thing to check out, and feel free to reach back to us with any questions.
Well, I guess that is a wrap, everyone. Thank you, Ben and Alan, for giving our listeners some insight into the good, the bad, and the ugly of Xcel's IRP and what it means for clean energy in Minnesota. I know we will be checking in soon on Minnesota Power and the Otter Tail Power IRPs, which are on the not so distant horizon, but we don't have to think about that right at this moment. So thank you guys for being here. You can stay up to date on Fresh Energy's work via our blog at fresh-energy.org or follow us on social media. You can check out our website for a blog post on the Xcel IRP, as well as some details on how to engage and submit feedback. I think through mid-March, perhaps, the public feedback is running. So check our blog post for exact dates and how to do that. In the meantime, thank you everyone for listening and subscribing to the podcast. You can support Fresh Energy's work by making a donation today. Visit our website at fresh-energy.org and click Donate in the upper right corner. Thank you for listening.